Hi, this is Bob Scully, and welcome to another edition of The World Show, a new series we call Ladies of the House, Ladies of the White House. And our first guest, our inaugural guest, was born on August 18th, 1927 in Plains, Georgia. Now that kind of gives it away, doesn't it? Rosalynn Carter today works at the Carter Center, an institution that she has built up with her husband, former President Jimmy Carter. He works in the area of worldwide conflict resolution, something that gets a lot of publicity. She works in an area that's just as worthwhile, although it does get less visibility, and she'll tell us about that, the area of mental health that she's felt very strongly about for decades. But we do get into the White House years, of course, and you'll see that Rosalynn Carter is very frank about that and is not afraid to get emotional about it. Here she is. Mrs. Carter, you have written a fascinating book that is still in the bookstores about the love of your life. It's not about Mr. Carter, it's about helping someone with mental illness, and for the past 30 years, I dare say, this has been your main preoccupation. And I want to quote from this book. Three little paragraphs. I have learned from my correspondence and from my work over the years that many sufferers, especially individuals with depression and panic disorder, run from doctor to doctor thinking that what's bothering them is purely physical. They suffer so much before they finally get help. I have a friend who says illnesses that are understood gain dignity. All of the exciting research you will be reading about is adding to the understanding of mental illness that for so long has eluded us. And finally, before she died, the great anthropologist Margaret Mead came to visit me at the White House. We talked of our shared interest in mental health. She said to me that if we select for our first consideration the most vulnerable among us, the emotionally disturbed child, the institutionalized person with psychosis, the street addict, then our whole culture is humanized. She believed that our value as individuals, our success as a society, could be measured by the compassion we show for the vulnerable. Can we measure up to Margaret Mead's standards? So I throw the question back to you. Have we, after all these years, you've worked 35 years at this, is it getting better? And I mean now, society, I don't mean cures, I mean how we see mental illness.
No, I don't think we are much better than we were a long time ago. We've made progress in some areas, and I'm talking about services and helping those who suffer. One thing that's different is that we know so much more about the brain now and have new medications and that kind of thing, but it's still very difficult for people to get services unless they have a lot of money. And it's also, there's also another problem, and that is that primary care doctors don't recognize mental illnesses. They don't have that kind of training in medical schools. And so people still go when they think, when depressed, for instance, and they don't feel good. They don't go to a mental health specialist. Mm-hmm. They go to their primary care doctor, and the primary care doctor might treat them for something or not know what's wrong with them, and they go again and again and again before they get the right kind of help. Another reason for that is not just that the primary care doctors don't recognize it, but that people don't want to go to a mental health professional because of stigma. Mm-hmm. And that still don't want to be labeled mentally ill. And so, but as far as services and so forth, we had a president's new commission on mental health recently. And the statement that the commission made at the end of that study was that the mental health system in our country is in a shambles. And there's no way to fix it. We have to just start over.
Wasn't it, as a matter of fact, the greatest victim of the first social cuts? Because we I remember in New York City on the streets, all of a sudden, people appeared who had no business there. And the vague talk was, well, we'll send them to family and community. But there was no family, there was no community. Mm-hmm. So obviously we...
Well, that dates back to the Community Mental Health Centers Act when, well, a lot of big institutions, there was a big expose of our institution in Georgia. And there was the same thing across the country back in the 1960s. But when people were turned out of facilities with no place to go, today it is service. Most of those either went back into some kind of treatment or something, but still, because when Jim was president in 1971, we didn't have, I mean 1976, when he was governor in 71, we didn't have homeless on the streets like we have now, and so many of those are mentally ill, and even when he was president. But the way the services work is if you are a danger to yourself or someone else, you can get help. But you go to a facility, and when you're no longer a danger to some, when they say that you're no longer a danger to them, you're out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it might be 72 hours. It might be less than that, and there's no way you can get a person stabilized in that length of time. So they're back. What they're supposed to do is go to the community mental health center, but to be sure they get the medication. They don't make it back. They're just back on the street.
And when I read the book, really the enemy seems to be, the real obstacle is in ourselves. And that's why you talk to people who are supposed to help others and give care. It's shame and snickering. You talk about all these examples of the vocabulary in cartoons and everywhere else that laugh at lunatics, quote unquote. You mentioned one time you were on a plane to Valdosta to go open a health center, and they decided to close it that very day, even before the opening.
That's right.
So the shame is very strong, and it's still there. Why?
I think it's beginning to lift just a little bit as people, as we, as scientists, have learned more about the brain, and people are beginning to realize, and that's what we work on at the Carter Center all the time, trying to educate people and let them know that mental illnesses should be considered just as other kinds of illnesses, because they're all part of the body, they're all biological, the brain is part of our biology, and there should be no shame or discrimination, no shame for the person and no discrimination against them if they have a mental illness. Anybody ought to be able to get help for mental illness without feeling any kind of shame about it. It has not happened, of course has not happened yet. The stigma is still there, but I do think as people are becoming a little more knowledgeable about mental illnesses and the causes of mental illnesses, that it's beginning to lift a little bit. If it does, that'll be the greatest thing that could happen for people with mental illness.
It would certainly relieve a lot of suffering, since a lot of the suffering comes from that.